Hello everyone, welcome to meeting 16. Something different tonight. We're switching the focus, the world affairs focus, to Africa, and I think we're going to do it in a different way with tonight's distinguished speaker, because it's my great pleasure to welcome David Pilling. And we met when he was talking about his book that's mentioned in his profile, The Growth Delusion. He was talking about it at Buxton Festival about 6 years ago, and it's taken. The Mountie always gets his man in the end, and I've managed to persuade David to come to talk to us. He is not an economist, but that book was really interesting because it showed some of the weaknesses of relying on GNP measures. It may or may not come into tonight's talk because that's, as you know, about Africa, and let's talk about the FT and see what your views are. But I mean, my view is that it's not about share prices, and I think if you're going to work for the FT, then you've probably got to get your facts right, and it's probably one of the most reliable newspapers around for objective information globally. So if you're going to work for the FT for 25 to 30 years, you've got to know your stuff. That's my feeling, and that's why I'm so delighted that David is with us. And before that, we had Rula Khalaf, who came about 5 years ago. She's now the editor of the Financial Times, and if you remember, she came to talk about Syria. But David has for many years been the Africa editor. He may tell us how many of the countries he's visited, and I don't think there's going to be any particular emphasis he's going to make, except, as you can see on the slide, I think he's going to give us a totally different story from that we heard from our previous speakers. And let's just remind ourselves that it's not a country. It is a very large continent. There are 54 countries, and not all of them are named there. So I have no idea which aspects and which areas of Africa David is going to be talking about. That is the excitement for us all. And so without further ado, David, welcome to World Affairs. We look forward to everything you've got to say.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the very kind introduction. Thank you all for turning out. It's great to see so many people turning out to hear about a continent that is often marginalized, and something that I will be talking about tonight. Just a tiny bit about me. I've been at the Financial Times for 30 years. I started out in London. I went to Latin America. I covered the pharmaceutical industry. I've done editing roles. Then I went to Asia for 15 years. I was in Tokyo for 7. I ran our Asian operations, which was the area from Afghanistan to Australia, for another 7. So I was 15 years in Asia, and then I came to Africa. And you'll probably hear a little bit in the talk tonight, and certainly if you read my coverage, you'll see that to some extent I look at the continent through an Asian prism, which slightly distinguishes, I don't know if that's the right word, but certainly makes me slightly different in the way I approach the continent. And you'll probably hear a little bit about that tonight. Now, I'm going to talk about Africa, which is a controversial thing to do in and of itself, and I will address that a little bit later. Just to assure you, I am well aware that Africa has 54 countries, 55 if you count the Western Sahara, which of course Morocco decisively does not. 54 countries recognized. Somaliland, which is another kind of breakaway republic from Somalia, also not recognized, but is a kind of de facto state. I'm also aware that roughly 1/3 of the world's 7,000 languages are spoken in Africa, and a number of the others are spoken in Papua New Guinea. So if you take out Papua New Guinea, you're probably talking roughly about half the world's languages or getting on for. In other words, this is a highly complex and vast, as we will hear in a minute, continent, extraordinarily diverse. It's so diverse that, in fact, I do not cover North Africa. The FT, in its wisdom, in quotation marks, does not count Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, etc., as part of Africa. Now, that is also something that one could debate, but you can see that you have a continent, former British colonies, former Portuguese colonies. You have coastal states. You have states around the equator, very tropical. You have the Sahel. So you've got a vastly diverse region. These are all reasons for not talking about Africa as a total, but I am going to do that anyway. Another reason is that there is huge ignorance about the geography of Africa. We may put up the original slide again in case that's helpful. But it is surprising. I come across really quite educated people who have a very limited idea of where countries are, and I've sort of now got the map of Africa pretty firmly in my head, and so it sometimes sort of shocks me. Just to give one example, when there was an Ebola outbreak in Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone 6 or 7 years ago, a number of people cancelled their safari holidays to Kenya. This is something like 6,000 miles away. This is a little bit like hearing that there are student protests in Santiago, in Chile, and cancelling your holiday to Disneyland in Florida as a result. So in other words, there is tremendous ignorance about the size and the diversity of this continent. Now, my aim tonight is to convince you that though the continent is marginalized, which is I will talk about next, that Africa is already hugely important and will become more and more important to the world we live in. So that's my aim tonight. This is a map of the continent. Now, you may not, I don't know how easily you can see the names of the countries here named, but basically, this is to give you an idea of the size. So you have, within the African continent, you have China, you have India, you have the United States, you have all of Europe, you have Japan. This is a huge continent, as I know, because I fly across it an awful lot. And when you go from one country to another, you can be 5, 6, 7 hours in an aeroplane. When I was a kid, my parents were progressive enough, I guess, to give me the Robinson projection of the world rather than the Mercator projection, which obviously distorts how we normally see the continent. And the Robinson projection shows Africa sort of looming much larger. Some of you will know, just to give you a few examples, that the Democratic Republic of Congo, formerly Zaire, formerly the Belgian Congo, is the size of Western Europe. It has one kind of big passable road, which I've been down. I say passable, it's not that passable. This is a massive country, which I'll talk about a tiny bit later. But a lot of people know that fact. Some people do not know the fact that Madagascar, an island that sometimes people get mixed up with Mauritius, which is a very small island. Madagascar is the size of Ukraine, which we now know is the biggest country in Europe. Again, Madagascar has a very poor road, which I've had the pleasure of being on. It takes you 6, 7, 8 days to go from north to the south, if you're lucky, and in the dry season. Chad, where I was just last week, the week before last, for a couple of weeks, is a country twice the size of France. I'm just sort of driving home the fact that this is a big continent. Now, size doesn't particularly matter, you might argue. We use a different measure, a measure that I wrote a book about, GDP. And although I wrote an entire book kind of undermining this concept in many ways, it is actually a very good number, and it tells you some very interesting and quite real things. The African continent, although it has 18% of the world's population at the moment, accounts for about 3% of global GDP, and it accounts for 3% of global trade. In other words, it massively, by that measure, which doesn't tell you everything, but does tell you something, punches, let's say, well below its weight. And by the time that this talk's over, you'll kind of begin to understand, I think, why a little bit. Osaka, so I used to live in Japan. Osaka, which is the second biggest city in Japan, has a GDP that's bigger than every African country bar three, Egypt, South Africa, and Nigeria, but is bigger than, say, Tanzania or an Ethiopia, and certainly much bigger than many other economies. Spain, medium-sized European economy, is 22 times the size in GDP terms. That's output, basically. 22 times the size of DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo. That's despite the fact that the DRC has 100 million people, far more than Spain. It has a rainforest, nothing to do with GDP, but it has a rainforest that is the second biggest in the world, second biggest to the Amazon. And by the Amazon, some people think is now is no longer a carbon sink because of the rate by which it's being chopped down. The rainforest in Congo is still a sink. Therefore, it's sometimes called the lungs of Africa, to some extent even the lungs of the world. That's contained within this country that is tiny as judged by the size of its economy. And as we'll also hear a bit later, many of the critical minerals in the world are in DRC. Now, as a result of this, what I would call marginalization, Africa gets pretty sort of short shrift when it comes to global bandwidth, people thinking about it, people writing about it, people talking about it. I was just on the phone this morning to some people in Sudan, because I'm about to write a couple of pieces on Sudan. Sudan, a war broke out last April. This is a war that follows quite an uplifting revolution, people's movement that was able to throw out a man called Omar al-Bashir, who had run the country for 30 years, an Islamist. He was on the ICC's list, the first head of state on the ICC's list as a war criminal. He was thrown out as a result of this revolution. It became quite a kind of hopeful country for a few years. Unfortunately, it's now descended into a civil war. You have 8 million people have been displaced. 2 million people have fled the country. You have 20 million people are now going hungry. The point is that this is a country that receives very, very little in terms of global news. Clearly, we are obsessed, and rightly so, by Ukraine, by Gaza at the moment, two absolutely awful tragedies, and one shouldn't compare numerically. But if you were to compare numerically, you've got 8 million people displaced versus 1.5 in Gaza, clearly not proportionally, because that's virtually the whole of the Gazan population. But still, the point I'm trying to make is that we do relegate Africa, whether it be tragedies or whether it be better news stories, and hopefully I will come across some of those in my talk. We relegate those in terms of the news and our thinking about the world. Why am I going to talk about Africa? It is very unfashionable to talk about Africa. There is a website called Africa is a Country, deeply ironic in its title. The point, of course, is that Africa is not a country. Africa is a vast continent made up of all these different countries that I've spoken to you about. Bill Clinton once arrived. To my shame, I can't actually remember where he arrived, but he arrived somewhere on the continent, and he tweeted, "Just touched down in Africa," to which somebody in Kenya wrote, "This man must be Superman. He's just landed in 54 countries at the same time." There's a man called, who has now sadly died, called Binyavanga Wainaina, who there was a whole magazine was devoted to Africa, and he was so incensed by some of the kind of cliches that were paraded in this magazine, that he wrote an essay called "How to Write About Africa." Again, entirely ironic. So what he really meant was how not to write about Africa. This is the one quote I'm going to read tonight. He wrote, "Africa is hot and dusty, with rolling grasslands and huge herds of animals and tall, thin people who are starving. Or it is hot and steamy, with very short people who eat primates. Don't get bogged down with precise descriptions." Now, I very much take what he says to heart. I hope that I and the Financial Times and people who write seriously about Africa, that we do deal in complexity, in nuance. But there are many reasons, I think, not to think about Africa as individual countries and to sometimes think of it as a continent. So why? Let me give you one very personal example. One fact about the continent, which I will come to later, is that the median age on the continent is 19. And this is the youngest continent in the world by a country mile. So in Britain, it's about 38. It might be slightly higher than that. Japan, where I used to live, is 48. This is a very young continent. And once I spent the best part of a year on my kind of travels around the continent doing many other things, I assure you, but I interviewed 19-year-olds all around the continent because I thought it would be a great piece to write about the world's youngest continent. What are 19-year-olds in Africa, in rural settings, in the cities, in Anglophone countries, in Francophone countries, etc.? What do they think? Because I thought that they would think things that would be surprising to readers. I thought that they would talk about technology, they would talk about family size, they would talk about ambition, they would talk about all sorts of things that you would be very surprised about. An editor at the FT said we couldn't run this piece because it was about Africa and there was no such thing. We shouldn't be talking about Africa. We should be talking about individual countries. Or I should interview someone from all 54 countries. Imagine a piece with quoting people from 54 countries. It would be unreadable. So as a result, all these 19-year-olds who'd given me their time, their thoughts, never saw the light of day in the Financial Times. This kind of quite annoyed me, I have to say. There can be reasons for talking about the continent. One of them is that the 54 countries in Africa are a colonial construct. They were dreamt up by European cartographers, mainly in Berlin, in a conference where Africa was kind of divided up. In many ways, these are quite false, arbitrary borders. Actually, one of the very interesting things about the continent since independence, because of course we associate the continent with bad news, one of the very interesting things is that very few countries have actually gone to war. There's been violence, there have been civil wars, there have been very few disputations of those borders. The examples, South Sudan broke away from Sudan, Eritrea broke away from Ethiopia. That's kind of it. Those borders held quite firmly, even though they were totally arbitrary. I once went to a place called Bidi Bidi in northwestern Uganda. It was a refugee camp. And 1 million people, one of the biggest outflows of people, had moved from South Sudan, which was a country that was in tremendous problems at the time. 1 million people came and set up in this region of Uganda, where they were kind of welcomed. And I was quite surprised at the welcome they got. There was very little pushback, very little resistance. Of course, all these people spoke more or less the same language. A lot of people spoke a language called Kakwa. People told me, well, these are our brothers and sisters. Like, why wouldn't we let them in? Quite surprising, and showed you really that the border between, in this case, Uganda and what had been Sudan, now South Sudan, because South Sudan had broken away, was in a sense quite arbitrary. There's another reason for talking about Africa, which is that it's nothing to do with a kind of Westerner misunderstanding the continent. Of course, the great independence heroes, Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, they were very much Pan-Africans. There was thought about about cooperation, about suppressing the differences between these countries. Now, although they haven't gone to war, some of that kind of idealism has certainly not been fulfilled. But the idea of a Pan-Africanism is by no means a kind of a Western implant. Quite the reverse, I would say. So I think there can be reasons for talking about Africa. There are things going on at the moment that kind of speak to the continent as a whole. So, for example, when there was a COVID outbreak, I was in Ethiopia. I was sat in the office of a man called John Nkengasong in the Africa CDC. This was in early February 2020, when Britain was very kind of lackadaisical about this kind of what turned out to be this sort of coming pandemic. This guy was already incredibly switched on. Airports were already checking people. There were heat sensors. They were taking notes of where people were coming from, where they were going to. When I spoke to Nkengasong, there was no country on the continent could test for COVID-19. By the end of that month, there were 40 countries, 40 out of the 54. They kind of switched on a Pan-African approach because he knew that there was a joke, sort of, going around at the time, which was that there were more vice presidents in South Sudan, 5, than there were ventilators, 4. At the time. So Nkengasong knew that if this thing hit, and if it was as bad as it appeared to be in Italy, etc., that the continent was going to suffer incredibly badly. So they switched on a kind of early warning system. In some ways, the continent did very, very well with incredibly limited resources during COVID. You'll remember that some of the strains of COVID-19 were actually identified in South Africa first, because there was a lot of very interesting genomics going on there and in Nigeria, in Senegal and around the continent. This was a continental effort. In other words, there are reasons. There are others, but in the interest of time, let me move on. Why is Africa poor? First of all, let's address the question, is it poor? Well, yes, I think it is. I mean, some people would dispute this and would give you other measurements and say this is a cliche, etc. But I think it is. I go back to my measure of GDP, the one I spent a whole book undermining, but it does tell you, as I said, something I think quite real. If you look at GDP per capita in the richest country in Africa, which is Mauritius, which is, it's an island. It's, in a sense, an aberration. It's not a typical African country. But even Mauritius, which has done extraordinarily well in many ways and has followed a kind of Asian development path, it has a GDP per capita of about $11,000. Mauritius is number 74 in the world in terms of wealth. That's as good as it gets. If you go to the bottom 20 countries in the world, GDP per capita, 17 of them are African. They are joined by North Korea, Afghanistan, and Yemen. So it's not great company. So I think we can say, yes, Africa is poor in general, albeit, of course, with huge variations. And there are many rich people in Africa, but that's not the question. Yes, there have been huge advances in health. So if you look at child mortality, if you look at life expectancy, it has gone up quite significantly. Though even so, life expectancy on the continent on average is 63. That's compares with the UK, roughly 80. So a 17-year difference. Nigeria, a country I will talk about a little bit later, trillions and trillions of dollars worth of oil wealth, was a country that people talked about when there was this Africa rising narrative going around. Nigeria's life expectancy, 53, very low. I would say shamefully low, given the resources that successive governments have had kind of at their command. So let me turn that question around. Why is Africa not rich, or why are some of these 54 African countries not rich? How did countries go from being poor to being rich? Now, we know that it can be done. I mean, obviously, we've seen You know, if you go back to 1800, everywhere had roughly the same GDP per capita because we were agrarian economies. You had the Industrial Revolution in Britain, spread to Europe, spread to, the US, Canada, etc. But then what we saw of great interest to me is Asian economic takeoff. Now, given how well many Asian countries have done, it's now you almost have to kind of think back. But if you go back to the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, probably even more recently, and you read some of the comments about Asia by, distinguished, quote unquote, economists, etc., you will have found basically kind of racist comments. These guys can't make it. They're culturally incapable. Their societies are not equipped. Something about the way the families are organized or whatever. After the war, when the Americans were occupying Japan, there was a paper that the Americans drew up for Japan's prospects. They suggested that Japan make silk and beads. This was the future of Japan's industrial economy. The Japanese said, thank you very much, I think we'll make electronics and cars. And you saw a whole bunch of other countries, many sort of based on what loosely could be called the Japanese model, rise up behind them. Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea, Taiwan, of course, China, and then countries that haven't done quite so well, but by African standards have done much better, your Malaysias, your Thailands, etc. So how did Asian countries do it? Well, they did it, if I were going to sum up how they did it, and of course there is no cut and paste model at all, but if I were to sum it up, I would say that they did it by pursuing basically unorthodox economic policies, not the economic policies that certainly the IMF or the World Bank would have been recommending at the time. They built up agricultural surpluses based on a kind of agricultural reform, which meant actually breaking up land into small patches of land that people then worked very intensely, and that built up a kind of capital surplus. They had something called financial repression, which basically meant that if you put your money in the bank, you got bad interest rates, but then the government could lend money to businesses, to chosen businesses, at cheap interest rates. They then had to be ruthless. They had to force those businesses to export. If they didn't, they withdrew capital. If they did and were competing, then they were allowed to. And this was thought to be entirely unorthodox. Japan had 11 car makers that made something like 100,000 cars. They were so bad, these cars, they were made by old tractor makers, that they couldn't get up American freeways. They couldn't get up the ramps. Any economist worth their salt would have said, don't bother. But Japan did, and so did Korea, and many other economies. And they've kind of proved that it can be done. One interesting thing about those economies is that few of them had actually natural resources. So when you go to many countries in Africa, you'll hear people very often, I've heard it hundreds and hundreds of times, we are a rich country. And what people mean by that is we have resources. We have gold, we have diamonds, we have oil, we have copper. And that's true. What many of the Asian success stories prove to you is you don't have to have those natural resources. And to some extent, they can be an impediment. And I think they have been an impediment to some extent on the African continent. Certainly, Africa, again, I'm talking about 54 countries, but in general, few African countries have managed to emulate that Asian model. I may talk a little bit about why they haven't been able to. Is Africa hopeless or is it rising? Well, I would say it's neither. I would say the question is somewhat offensive. I couldn't actually find the Hopeless Africa Economist cover, but there was one. It was in 2000. It showed the continent and a guy with an AK-47. But by 2011, the same magazine had decided that Africa was rising. This was really because there were some very high GDP growth rates. There was a commodities boom. China had discovered Africa, and a number of other factors had come in to play. There was better government, probably because the Cold War had ended, and there were no longer sort of proxy wars going on. You had big debt write-offs, if you remember the Millennium Fund. So a lot of African governments had got into kind of trouble. Their debts were wiped out, so they were in a kind of healthier economic position. Some of them borrowed on the international capital markets, which provided a certain sort of market discipline. So you had kind of better governance. So things kind of did look a bit better. Nigeria was the economy that people especially got excited about, partly because there are so many people in Nigeria, now 200 million, then somewhat fewer, but still a lot of people. And this economy on the back of oil was growing at 6, 7, 8% a year, and then you get investors saying, this is the next big thing. People got very, very excited. I would say that they got too excited and that Africa was not rising, certainly not in the way that was being portrayed at the time. Now, why would I say that? If you just go back to a successful economy, what do? This is in obviously hugely simplistic terms, but they take a natural resource. These are ones certainly where their growth trajectory is based on a natural resource. They take a natural resource and they turn it into two other forms of capital, built capital and human capital. That means they invest. They invest the flow of wealth, say coming from oil, and they invest it into human capital, education, health, training. They invest it into built capital, roads, airports, power, all the things that enable you then to double down and to grow faster because you now have the public goods and the productive capabilities of growing. Nigeria was doing none of that. You only need to look at some statistics to see they were not investing in education. They were not investing in roads. They were not investing in power. The total power on the grid in Nigeria is about the same as in Manchester. Nigeria has 200 million people. This means that anybody who has any money in Nigeria basically has to rely on their own power, their own generators, their own mini grids. So they didn't reinvest money in the way that they ought to have done. So there was an element of, I would argue, illusion to their growth. So why has Africa failed to emulate Asia? I spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I've written about it. I've read tons of books on it. I would still say, in all honesty, I don't really know. I can offer you some theories, and perhaps some proximate causes. You can read whole books about how, institutions, you need proper institutions, functioning institutions. But that to me is not an answer. Then I would say, well, how do you get your proper institutions? That to me is a kind of a symptom of what's not gone right. If I were to write a book on Africa, which I probably won't, I would call it Africa Interrupted. If you look at the pre-colonial continent, there were about 1,000 different polities. I already mentioned how many languages there are on the continent. Nigeria alone has 350. There were empires, proto-empires, empires like the Ashanti. They were kind of well organized. They had what you could see as, a proto-state, something that might look not unlike, 19th century Europe. Remember, Italy, Germany didn't become unified countries until relatively recently. If you go back to some of the Asian countries that I saw being very successful, Japan, China, South Korea, they have policies, states that go back much, much longer. The Chinese had a civil service going back 1,500 years at the very least, a civil service exam, probably longer. Language, literacy, going back an awful long way. State formation in Africa is very new. These states were invented in the 1880s in Berlin by outsiders. Western colonialism, I'm not even talking about kind of, sort of Arab colonialism or influx of Arabs in the Arab slave trade, which was very damaging in its way as well. But Western colonialism lasted a very short period. We kind of came in, stayed a bit, sucked a lot of things out and left. State formation has not happened in the same way that it has in Europe and that it had in Asia. And this may just be a question of time. I mean, a lot of these countries are 60 and 70, 80 years old and no older. And I think that's very important, because then when you have a government that comes into power, rather than trying to push the nation as a whole, as you saw in Asia, there was this kind of attempt to rise up, to rise nations up, Mao said China has stood up. He said it a little bit too early. It was really Deng Xiaoping that made China stand up. But China has stood up. But you couldn't really say Nigeria has stood up. Nigeria didn't really exist before it was kind of pieced together by colonialism. So I think this is very important. The international system also, you could argue, is quite stacked against new entrants. There was a book by a friend of mine called Hajun Chang called Kicking Away the Ladder. A lot of the kind of economic orthodoxy about opening up to foreign capital, about not protecting infant industries. This tends to favor those who have already made it. And if you go back to Asian countries, they, as I was suggesting earlier, they really rose up the ladder, I think, by breaking a lot of these rules. They did restrict capital inflows and outflows. They did distort their financial systems. They did protect infant industries. They did protect winners. That is all a little bit more difficult in the age of the World Trade Organization, even though that's lost quite a lot of its power now. And even though industrial policy has kind of come back as almost a kind of respectable thing these days. There's a book called Gambling on Development by Stefan Durkon, who's an Oxford economist. And I would actually suggest that you invite Stefan to talk here. It's a very interesting book. He sort of says that, you have an elite, and at one extreme, the elite is just extractive. It's just trying to extract wealth. It acts as a kind of gatekeeper. The other extreme is that you gamble on development. You try and grow the economy. You open up things. Of course, the gamble there is that you may be toppled. You may find that there are people richer, more powerful than yourself. Much better, if you're in power, to keep wealth. It's how an economy shifts from here to there that is the real kind of key. I was going to talk about the new scramble for Africa. I think I will skip that, as I see that I've been talking a little bit longer than I'd expected. Basically, a number of countries in the world, China, Turkey, India, latterly Russia, the Gulf states, are now competing heavily for the continent. This is both a threat, I would argue, and also an opportunity. And it's up to African leaders, insofar as they are leading for their people and not just for themselves. It's up to them to exploit that competition and to use that for, what you might call agency, or what you could, in more simple terms, say, to get a better deal. Let me move on to this, which is, in a sense, I guess, the crucial slide. Africa in numbers. As I said earlier, my favorite number about the continent is 19. That's the median age in Africa. Some people, you will hear investment bankers say, this is the great hope of the continent. It's a young, dynamic, new market. All the action is going to be on the continent. I would dispute that. If you look at Asia, its growth partly was predicated on a very high birth rate, followed by a precipitous drop in a birth rate. And what that produced was a lot of people in the workforce with very few dependents, either older people or younger people. The problem, in a sense, in Africa is that you still have a stubbornly high birth rate. It has come down. It's now about 4.2. I'm sure you'll know that the replacement rate to maintain a population is 2.1. I'm sure you'll also know that many countries, many of the richer countries in Asia and in Europe are way, way below that, to the point where people are talking about a crisis. 1, 1.2, 1.3 is not unusual. Africa, 4.2. Great variations. Niger, the highest is 6.9. Tunisia, the lowest, 2.1 replacement value. But on average, 4.2. What does that mean for the population of the continent? Well, in simple terms, it means it's growing very, very fast. Let me just give you one of the most useful numbers I've ever heard. It was something that Hans Rosling, a Swedish, some of you may know him. He's a Swedish, unfortunately he died a few years ago, health expert and statistician, a brilliant man who I've actually had the pleasure to know and even been on stage with. He said the PIN code of the world is 1114. What does that mean? It means there's 1 billion people. These are rough numbers. 1 billion people in the Americas, 1 billion people in Europe, 1 billion people in Africa, and 4 billion in Asia. Wind forward to 2050, what happens? The PIN code of the world is 1125. Europe and America, we've stopped growing. Africa doubles. In fact, it will be 2.4 billion by 2050. And Asia adds 1 billion and then stops. And by the way, these are not kind of crazy projections. These are more or less baked in. Beyond 2050, we don't really know, or we don't know with the same kind of accuracy. But we do sort of know. So wind forward to 2100, the PIN code of the world becomes 1145. Asia, Europe, and the Americas have stopped growing from 2050. Africa doubles again. But you don't need that kind of futurology. You don't need to look to 2100. Let's look at 2050. That's, it's a generational way, basically. 1/4 of all human beings will be African. At independence, 1 in 11 people were African. 1 in 4 people in the world will be African in 2050. 1/3 of all youth will be African, people between 18 and 24. 2 of every 5 children born, not in 2050, but in 2040, will be born on the African continent. So what happens in Africa, just by kind of sheer numerical value, not only affects what happens to the rest of the world, it is the rest of the world. 1 in 4 of us will be African. If you're a tall internationalist, and after all, we were all African once, 1 in 4 of us will be African. So what is happening on that continent, for good or bad, will be the future of the world. That, in a sense, is one of my important points. If we look to the future, the decisions that are made on the African continent will affect us all, whether we live on the African continent or not. Just as Asia, 20 or 30 years ago, loomed quite small and now looms larger, probably not large enough for in our imaginations if you consider that by some measures China is already the biggest economy in the world. Africa will begin to loom larger. You're beginning to see kind of hints of this in music, in the arts. A couple of years ago, the Prix Goncourt, the Nobel Prize, which was won in literature, which was won by Abdelrazak Gurna, and I think the Booker were all won by Africans. A Burkinab from Burkina Faso architect won the Pritzker Prize, which is the premier architectural prize. The fastest urbanizing continent in the world is Africa. It's gone from 50 or 60 years ago, 10 or 12% of the population living in cities. It's already creeping up to 50% and will go over that threshold. As soon as you get all these people living in cities, and if any of you have been to big, throbbing African cities like Lagos, like Nairobi, like Kinshasa, you will know the kind of energy, the creativity. You know, you've got high-tech companies that have become unicorns, billion-dollar companies. There's now a number of those around Africa. These are made in Africa, made by Africans, made to solve African problems. Now, you've probably heard me enough to know I'm not just beefing up the continent. This place has enormous, huge problems that we can discuss in the Q&A. But there is also tremendous youthful dynamism, creativity, artistic, entrepreneurial. You know, you take a Nigerian out of Nigeria, which is dysfunctional in many ways. And they do incredibly well. They score the best scores in American universities. They rise to the top of companies. You know, we're dealing with a population with sort of tremendous amounts to offer. Just a couple of final thoughts. You know, what the African continent decides to do in terms of moving into fossil fuels or not moving into fossil fuels will have enormous impact on climate change. Uganda, to give you one fact, Uganda, which has just discovered an awful lot of oil, by the way, its emissions of carbon are 0.1 tons per capita per year. In America, I think that is, if I'm remembering correctly, about 20 tons per year. 0.1 versus roughly 20. If they go anywhere near an American lifestyle, if they even aim for an American lifestyle based on fossil fuels, that's going to tip all of our climate projections to hell. So we better hope that there are green solutions, that these economies can grow and prosper without following the path that we have followed. And just a final thought, if they don't follow a path of prosperity, then we really do have a problem, because you'll have a third of the world's youth with no jobs, with no prospects, you know, turning to terrorism, as we're seeing in the Sahel, getting on boats. You know, we better hope that Africa prospers. It certainly can. There is nothing in history that would tell us that it can't prosper, because other regions of the world have done it. I very much hope that African economies, that African countries, that African people will prosper. If they do, you'll know about it, and if they don't, you'll also know about it. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. We're lots of questions as usual, and Harry and Zena will have the microphones. Zena's at the back. Yes, at the back. Just put your hand up. They'll spot you if you want to ask a question. There's one in the bottom right. I might preempt his question. Okay. Who knows? I might know what he's going to ask, because I do have some questions in that area. But let's start off with. This idea of Africa versus African countries has triggered a few thoughts. So Hazel, as the population of quotes Africa increases, it would he's wondering how it's going to play a part as a world state. So this would surely require, which he says, unity is her key word. Doesn't this need unity of the 54 countries? And how far do you think these countries have moved towards unity? I'll couple that with John Bourne's question. He's put it a different way. Are there any EU-style groupings of countries to protect more local industries against the more established industrial countries that you mentioned in your talk? And just so there's, if you like, unity, there's the EU model, and then Graham Daly is asking, isn't South Africa the inverted commas market leader in the continent's development. So, if you like, there's sort of three different ways of thinking about how inverted commas Africa can make progress. Would you like to sort of explore all those for us?
Sure. So unity, I mean, you wouldn't expect unity, but there are attempts at times to speak with a single voice. Obviously, there's something called the African Union that used to be called the OAU. It's now called the African Union. It's headquartered in Addis Ababa. You know, as one would expect, it can be dysfunctional. It can fail to solve. You know, there's a big mantra about, solving Africans to solve African problems, and often it doesn't. Often it fails. Often it's absent. It's been very absent, for example, in the crisis that we're seeing in Sudan at the moment, when there was a big crisis in Ethiopia with the war in Tigray a few years ago. I would say it was also absent. But sometimes it is there. I mentioned the Africa CDC, which comes under the African Union. That was really rather effective during COVID. There is now a move underfoot, as the EU was mentioned. There is a move underway now to form something called the African Continental Free Trade Area, which every country has signed up to. Politically, it's been a great success. On the ground, and what it means in real terms, it is for sure work in progress, but the idea behind it is very good, I would argue. One of the problems with the continent is you have these 54 countries, many of which are very small in economic terms. To attract investment into a single country with its own regulatory framework, its own borders, its own problems, its own bureaucracy, its own people that you might need to bribe, etc., is clearly a problem, and many companies don't bother. If you can create anything approaching a single market, this becomes a much more attractive proposition. So, for example, inter-African trade is about 11%, with 89% of goods, approximately, leaving the continent. Unfortunately for the continent, a lot of those goods leave in raw material form. You have still a very extractive economy. They leave, they may come back as manufactured goods, or they may just leave for good. So the value added, which you need, is not being done on the continent. Now, if you look at intra-African trade, although it's small, the stuff that moves between countries has more value added. So it might not be tomatoes, it might be a tin of tomatoes. It might be dried fish. It's not we're not necessarily talking, cars and electronics, although there's a bit of that going on. But, it might be something much simpler, but it's still value added. It still adds value. So the more trade that can be done within Africa, the better. And there is, as I say, this political attempt. Now we're going to have to see how that works. South Africa, is South Africa the market leader? Certainly in sub-Saharan Africa, it's been the most sophisticated economy. There is still some world-class industry in South Africa. South Africa has enormous problems, which I could address later. I'm not particularly optimistic about the near medium-term prospects of South Africa. But if you're talking about how sophisticated an economy it is, how much manufacturing and value added is done in South Africa, yes, it is way ahead of most other countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Not North Africa. Morocco is every bit as sophisticated, for example, Egypt. I'll leave it there. There's probably other things I could say, but I want to just
maybe the other
keep it moving along.
Yes, I've got quite a lot of questions about climate change and the wider implications of that. So if we could sort of work our way through those.
Yep.
And I'll start off with David Roots. So he's wondering, will agriculture and food production be able to support the substantial increase in population that you talked about? And Ian Brown, with the population growth that you've talked about, climate change impacts and the impact of politics, how will the continent feed itself? And he says, will water supplies become the big issue? So let's start with that.
Okay. All right. Will Africa be able to feed itself? Well, let's hope so, but it's not feeding itself now. Huge amounts of agricultural land on the continent, but the continent is a big net importer of food. Lots of your, let's take Angola, a big oil exporter. If you go into a supermarket in Angola, everything is imported. Everything comes from somewhere else. Even simple things, tomatoes, fruit, so much is imported. A lot of, of course, there are big exceptions. South Africa is a very big farming country. It's a big exporter. Kenya does pretty well, but if you're looking in aggregate, this is a failure of policy. I would argue yields very low, and a lot of precious foreign exchange spent on importing food. So as so if that continues, then it will have to import more and more food. So what needs to happen is you need to have improvements in agricultural production. That's a whole other area as to why that's not happening. Land ownership is a problem. People don't own the land that they till often, or there's disputes, or there's overlapping kind of land systems. Roads to take food from the countryside to the cities are not necessarily there. They are in some countries, but not in others. If you can't sell food, you're not going to produce it. You just produce what you need for yourself, which means that the cities then have to fend for themselves. So there's a big problem. Climate change will have a huge impact. Farmers are already very confused. This is anecdotal, but in a sense, that's all you're going to get. You get a lot of talk about the rains used to come in this month, and now we've no idea when they're coming. And given that there's very little irrigation, that it's most agriculture outside South Africa and a few other countries is rain-fed agriculture. When the rains come, how much they come is a huge, huge problem. Water, I'm sure it will be a problem. There's a lot of water under the ground. Lots of water can be tapped. Again, that's a technological question. But in whole areas, the Sahel, for example, where you've had a kind of marching of the desert and a degradation of a lot of the agricultural land, you've got a real problem there. This will need technological and political solutions, but it's not a optimistic picture, I wouldn't say.
Just for building on that, we've got a couple of questions about the green aspect. So Sue Traylor. Surely solar power must be harnessed as an important contribution to development in many countries in Africa. What are the prospects for that? And Ian Watson looks at it a different way. Is climate change the limiting factor on economic growth in Africa in the future? Or is there, in fact, a green path to prosperity?
Yeah, both very good questions. So
do you mind if we turn you slightly so the members over there can see as well?
Sure. So solar power, yes. There's actually quite a lot happening. If you look at Morocco, that you have one of the biggest solar power installations in the world. I think it's called Desert to Power. South Africa is moving now, finally, very rapidly to solar power. There's been huge installation of solar. As many of you will know, South Africa's had huge problems of electricity with the old coal-fired power stations failing for various reasons that I could go into. But you are having a shift on an off-grid level. This is small solar power installations. There's also an awful lot going on. So the figure that you often hear is that 600 million people have no access to electricity. This figure's been, I've used it myself. I suspect that it's an overestimation because a lot of people have access to off-grid power. The way this often works is shows that there is a kind of a leapfrogging, which gets onto the second. There is a leapfrogging element to some of the things that are going on the continent. So in Kenya, again, if I may be telling you things you know, but in Kenya there was something called M-Pesa, which was brought in now more than a decade ago, which was a way of moving money around on a mobile phone. Kenyans come to London and they go, "My God, you're so a bit backward here. Why can't you pay for things in the way we do?" Because this is routinely done. You can go to a market and buy tomatoes, and you pay for it by sending money from your phone to their phone. Very, very simply done. What's this got to do with solar power? So a number of companies have built up all over the continent now where they install a solar panel in a village tens of miles, hundreds of miles from anywhere. You pay. How do you pay? You pay on your mobile phone. You may pay daily, 20 cents a day, 30 cents a day. If you don't pay, they turn it off, which they can do on a mobile phone. So there are all these kind of quite innovative things happening. The limiting factor question, I think, is a very, very interesting question, and I don't think anybody really has the answer. There has been no economy on planet Earth that has gone from being poor to becoming medium and then rich without using fossil fuels. It has not been done yet. We don't really know how to make steel without using coal. You know, when we have a solar-powered steel plant, you'll know we're making progress. Of course, hydrogen may be the answer, but a lot of this is untested. It's untested in terms of technology, and it's even more untested in terms of, will there be African countries that can do that? Can they go from no power to a hydrogen steel plant? We'll see. But if that's not possible, then one of two things will happen. One is they'll use fossil fuels, and the rest of the world will notice. The other is they won't, and they'll remain poor. Those are your sort of three paths.
And is the main constraint, is it capital? Is it the fact that these are poor countries? Alistair Duncan says, he sort of says, well, basically they have all this sunshine, essentially this wonderful source, better than we've certainly got in cloudy England. So it seems sort of obvious. So is it lack of capital that's the main limitation?
You need capital to build stuff. You need people to be able to pay for your power. How does we were talking about farmers, a subsistence farmer that doesn't earn cash, how are they going to pay for electricity, however it's produced? Somebody has to build the infrastructure to get it from A to B. They're presumably going to charge for that. If you have people who are, Nigeria, big country, Africa rising, you've got 90 million people in Nigeria living on less than $2 a day. Their capacity to pay for food, send their kids to school, pay for transport, and, by the way, pay for power is limited. And then you get into the chicken and egg situation. Who is going to provide power for people who can't pay for it? What a lot of governments will say is, you must provide power at this cost. But that cost is below the cost that you need to produce it. And of course, no company will do that. So you have this, as I said, sort of a chicken and egg problem. Things that look easy, why don't they just build solar panels? It's not always easy to get from A to B, and until you really kind of go somewhere where that is very poor and that is trying to move along this development path, you don't kind of almost realize how hard it is and what has had to happen in Britain, in Europe, in America, over decades and decades and decades. It's not just easy to switch it on, whether that be power or growth or what you might call development.
We've got a question on the front row of the balcony, right in the right-hand corner.
Sorry. It's working. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. An African population of between 2 and 3 billion is utterly terrifying to me, as I'm sure it is to many other people. Do the Africans actually take birth control seriously? Is it something they can gain access to easily? And do they understand that from their own point of view, that their own growth rate is unsustainable as far as they're concerned?
I would call that a controversial question in many senses. I mean, there are 9 billion people on planet Earth. There are 7.5, aren't there? If there are 3 billion Africans, 4 billion Africans, that's not to me scary in and of itself. 4 billion very poor, frustrated Africans. That's another matter. Birth control. I think women have. I would sort of slightly reframe your question. I think women have more children generally than they would like. So I think one of the ways of framing this is women's empowerment. If a girl gets married at 15 because she can't go to school, because the parents are not going to send her because she's a girl, because she's now menstruating and it's embarrassing to go to school and there's no hygienic pads. So what's the best thing that the family can do? Get her married off. Then she starts having kids. The way to break that cycle is to begin to, educate women. Yes, to have access to birth control if that's what she wants and that's what the couple wants. But I think it is about it's about power and empowerment. If you go to Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia, the fertility rate, the number of kids that women have, is about the same as Britain. Why? It's a city. It's connected to the whole of the rest of the continent by an airline that is every bit as efficient, and in my estimation, more efficient than, say, British Airways. These things can be done. None of this is inevitable. The reason that people have a lot of kids is because they're poor. That's why people have a lot of kids. When they get richer, they'll have fewer kids. And also, when they have fewer kids, they'll get richer. It's a sort of it's hard to work out cause and effect, and I suspect it goes both ways.
We've got quite a lot of questions about Russia and China, which I'll come on to. There's a specific that's being mentioned by several people, which is about the Wagner Group. So, John Mottram, could you comment on? He's read something in The Economist about Ukraine's special forces opposing Russian Wagner in the Sudan, and Chris Nibbs. Can you expand on the influence of the Wagner thugs who control the export of many resources, from timber to lithium? And Sheila Fonihoff. Since the West is now distracted by conflicts, Putin's Wagner is establishing fair control in sort of Eastern Central Africa. So what should the West be doing to break this cooperation? So let's just sort of focus on that.
Sure.
Wagner.
Well, let's start. What is the Wagner Group? It was run by this guy called Yevgeny Prigozhin, who died in spectacular fashion after his failed coup or whatever the hell was going on last year. Wagner is really a mercenary group. I think that they have links that are now much stronger with Russian intelligence services. I think they were more or less told, go to Africa. Of course, there were historic links between the Soviet Union and many African countries. Many liberation movements were financed, trained. There's a university in Russia called the Patrice Lumumba University. These links went back quite far. after independence, sort of Russian African ties faded a bit, but they came roaring back from I don't know when. Putin's second term, I would say, actually. So when Putin came back after his 4 years in absence, they sort of Russia came roaring back below the radar at first, because what they do is with very little spending, they're able to come in and create an awful lot of problems. So they're not actually really in East Africa. I think someone mentioned East Africa. They're really in Central Africa and the Sahelian region. So Central African Republic was the first place. Libya as well, actually. Libya, then Central African Republic, then Mali. They're nibbling away at Chad. They certainly have been in Sudan. They provide presidential guards. They will fight insurgencies more brutally than UN force would, or the French. And in return, they will try to get hold of resources. So in Central African Republic, they run gold mines. In Sudan, they run gold mines. In Mali, they tried to run gold mines, and as far as I'm aware, they haven't been able to do that, and they're actually paid. And then what happens is that the presidents of these countries, often very illegitimate, they may have come in through a coup, which was the case in Mali, which is the case in Burkina Faso, although Wagner isn't there very strongly, was the case in Sudan for sure. They protect the president, and the president becomes kind of captured. When I'm using the president as a kind of shorthand for the the authorities in control. They become captured because they're protected. And so for very little resource, Wagner has been able to create an awful lot of trouble, so much so that, if you talk to European intelligence agencies, they will say that Russia has kind of established almost like a second front in the Sahel. And we've seen country after country where France, which is the former colonial power in most of the countries that Wagner's involved in, not Sudan, but most of the others, has been kicked out. So France was kicked out of Mali, France was kicked out of Burkina Faso, Niger, the latest country, France was kicked out. So you've seen Russia moving into this vacuum, France being booted out. So for very little investment, Russia's caused an awful lot of problems on the continent, with potentially big problems even for Europe, if you think about the immigration routes that go through the Sahel and countries that they control. How you oppose this? I've no idea. The French were in some of these countries militarily. They had bases. The Americans still have bases. But I don't think there's necessarily a military answer to this. The Ukrainians, as somebody has said, have actually gone in and are taking on Wagner in Sudan. They're as far as I'm aware, they're using drones to drone Wagner operatives in some of the gold mines outside of Khartoum. So that's one way, I guess. But the short answer is that the Russians have been able to make an awful lot of trouble and quite a lot of headway. And I would say adding nothing to the African continent. They really are thugs, as somebody said.
To build on that, we've got a load of questions which are about the different parts that might be being played by China, by Russia, and by India. And whether that's for the good of Africa. I'd like to give you the flavour of some of those. And so, Sean King sort of sums it up quite well. What is China up to in Africa? Is it an aid giver, an investor, an exploiter, a colonialist, or none of these? So that's how he puts it. Jeff Tucker, to what extent is the Chinese and Indian and other economic influences a threat to the things you were talking about? That's the African countries' potential development and wealth sharing amongst Africans. So, and since you're in England, wonders whether you can spot any difference in the approach taken by the Chinese and the Russians in the way they exploit mineral wealth in Africa, in African countries. We'll start with theirs.
Okay, well, there's a lot going on in those questions. So I would put Russia to one side. I mean, Russia, I think, is an entirely malign influence. It sells arms, it extracts minerals, it kills people, it abuses human rights. I think, Russia is, there's nothing to be said, I would argue, for Russia's contribution to the continent. I think when you come to China, someone mentioned India. Turkey is actually a bigger investor. The Gulf states are now very big investors. I think the story is much more complex. I would argue, and it's not everybody would agree with me, but I would argue that China has been a net contributor to the continent. That does not mean that everything it does is benign, not at all. But I would say that the fact that China got interested on the continent in about 2000 has been, on balance, a positive. So why? China got interested because in about 2000 it became a net importer of goods. Until 2000, the economy was of such a size that it was a net exporter of coal, oil, other things. 2000, the economy got so big, it was adding a new power grid, a British-sized power grid per year. So it was expanding so fast, and China is so fast, that it became a net sucker in of resources. And it scoured the world for these, and it found a lot of them in Africa. Its model was certainly not aid. So someone said, "Is it an aid giver?" It's not an aid giver at all. You could describe it as an investor. Its early investment model was a sort of resource for infrastructure. So it got dibs on resources: oil, copper, cobalt. Those and others. And in return, it built infrastructure. It built roads, of varying qualities, but it built roads where former colonial powers, Britain, France, etc., had not really been able to build proper infrastructure. The infrastructure in the last 20 years on the continent has improved dramatically. It's still, in many countries it's terrible. In most countries it's very shoddy, but it's nothing like it was in terms of airports, ports, roads. And without those, this was China's great kind of thought, in a sense. Without that hard infrastructure, nothing's going to happen. You're not going to be able to develop. You're not going to be able to get your goods to port. You're not going to be able to get your goods from farm to city, as I was explaining before. So, in that sense, China's influence has been pretty good, I think. Now, there are many bad things it does. It plays pretty fast and loose with resources. There's a lot of deforestation. I've seen it with my own eyes in Madagascar, for example, where you have, huge exploitation of, say, redwood forests that just go out and for very little return. So, it's a benign and a malevolent player. I'm just arguing that on balance, the fact that you've now got African governments that can choose between this competition for their resources, it means if they're savvy and if they're running for the good of the country and not just for the benefit of themselves, then that does give them agency, it does give them choice, it does give them potential investment. So it's a complex. One final fact: the 400 embassies have been opened on the continent since 2012. If I remember correctly, Turkey, the Gulf states, India, the three biggest, are the three countries that account for most of those embassies, or certainly the bulk of those embassies.
We've got about 10 minutes left and lots of questions still to go.
Okay.
So a quick word on the UK. And so Dave Bayless says, does Britain still have interests in Africa, or are we just a disliked colonial power? That's how he puts it. And Alison wonders, does the British exit from the European Union affect our relationship with Africa? And that's a complex one as well, but quick thoughts?
I'll just be quick on that. Does it have interests? I mean, Britain, the difference between Britain and France, so France sort of was much more present as a colonial power. Britain was much less present, just like in India, where India was governed by kind of a handful of British civil servants. There's a very sort of light touch, and it ruled through existing structures. A lot of the same happened in Africa. So when Britain left, it kind of left. And as a result, there isn't the resentment against Britain that there is against France. Does it still have interests? It has interest in the way that many other countries have interest. A lot of the critical minerals that are needed for the green transition are on the continent. Resources. So Britain is a reasonably large importer of African resources. Of course, there is some money to be made: service provision, insurance, ports, all the other things that Britain and many other countries provide. But remember, these are pretty small economies. It's still a very extractive relationship, I would say, in general. It does have interests. It also obviously has geopolitical and protective interests as well. But in terms of economic, those are the interests.
You outlined some of the possibilities for Africa, some of them positive. Harry and Zena, our students here, you've met. So they've got a good question about coups. So with a number of military coups across Africa in recent years, how far does this endanger the stability of the continent? Do you actually predict how many coups there are going to be in any given 5-year period? I mean, do you have any sense of how, I think that they're trying to find out is how far is this going to disrupt the ideal?
It's already disrupted. When I began this beat about 8 years ago, I was I was on the optimistic side. I saw lots of reasons to be quite positive about, not necessarily the continent as a whole, but about the sort of state of democracy. I went around the continent. I covered an awful lot of elections in countries like Ghana, Kenya, Malawi, and there was much positive to be seen. However, there began to be coups about 5 or 6 years ago, and I wrote a piece in the FT called "The Return of the Coup in Africa" or something like that, which I took a lot of flack for that piece. Sadly, it became it was quite prescient, not like all of my pieces, but this one was. And you have certainly seen a resurgence of the coup, almost entirely in former French colonies, Sudan and Zimbabwe being the exceptions, but apart from that, they're all in former French colonies. And it's highly destabilizing. Wagner and coups have been very much linked. Wagner will often come in after a coup. So that could be France out, Russia in. I'm of the belief that democratic countries tend to correct and self-correct more readily than dictatorships. People talk about benign dictators, but you're just as likely to get Kim Jong-un as you are Lee Kuan Yew. Whereas a democracy, as is often eloquently expressed by people lining up for hour after hour after hour voting in Africa, it's a very often moving thing to see, is that we can vote for these guys now, and if they don't perform, then in 4 years' time, we can vote them out. Sadly, that is less and less true throughout the continent, either because you have military governments or you have authoritarian leaders who are in power, who have learnt to game the democratic system, and who, no matter how many elections there are, they are going to be returned. So we're definitely seeing a retreat of democracy on the continent of Africa, and I think that's a bad thing.
I'm going to raise the question of charity, because I've got a question about that. And I contribute a small amount to an African charity run by someone I know. You've met members here who run a charity in Africa, and I think a lot of other members will be contributing in that way. So Maddie Hopley's question is probably quite salient for many of us here. Has all the overseas aid and charity been helpful or detrimental?
This is a huge question. If you look overall, I think that what is called aid has had many perverse incentives, has caused an awful lot of problems. I've sat in ministries where people say, you know what, we won't bother too much with education because that will be taken care of by foreign donors. And building up expertise, building up a tax base, building up a contract between the state and the people that are governed through taxes. You know, we pay your taxes, therefore we're your bosses, therefore you return services to us, creates a kind of a potential for a functioning state. If what you've got is money coming from outside, that sort of social contract is broken. This is not to say that I'm against aid, that I'm against charities, that I'm against particularly emergency aid, or indeed what's sometimes called capacity building, which can be vital, can save millions of lives, can build up the foundations for a better future. For example, vaccination efforts all over the continent, which has built up a healthier population that has a better chance of thriving. But it's a real curate's egg, and a lot of aid, I think, has been wasted, and a lot of aid has created what I would call perverse incentives.
Two questions coming. There's a lot of questions about corruption and what can be done to eradicate it. Across Africa, Nigeria gets mentioned because it's got lots of oil, therefore lots more wealth to be squandered. Marie Potter puts it a different way. Can you give us an idea of the political systems of a few representative countries and how well they function? Maybe you haven't got time to go into all of that, but you might be able to say whether there are any good models in the African continent that minimize corruption and that give hope for these countries to make the progress that you've outlined.
I mean, there are certainly countries that have done better than others. You know, Botswana is often mentioned as a country that has diamonds, but managed not to fall into the resource curse. And the resource curse has many aspects, but one of them is that you have an elite that are the gatekeepers to those resources. And what they do is they charge money for you to be able to get to those resources. DRC and Nigeria, actually, was mentioned, are two classic examples of this. What you want to happen is that you want, on the back of those resources, industry, expertise, value added to stay in the country and to become a kind of self-fulfilling wealth creator. That has not happened in most countries where you've had resources. So Nigeria, Angola, two of the worst examples. Countries that have not had huge amounts of natural resources. Senegal, Kenya have Ghana have built up better political systems. They're all works in progress. I mean, they are all over the world. But if the resources come before the institutions are built, that's tended to be a disaster. Much better to have the resources discovered once you've had better institutions build up. And these things take time. You know, Ghana went through a number of coups, but has not had a coup since the 90s. Senegal has never had a coup, although it just had a kind of constitutional slip a few weeks ago. There are examples of countries, imperfect as they are, that have begun to build up decent, solid institutions that can weather various storms. And much better that they do that before the resources are discovered than after.
There are lots of questions about migration from Africa to the global north, which I'm sorry, everyone, we can't put. But basically, some of those questions are suggesting that it's the talented Africans who are going to move to make things worse. But I'm going to end with a quirky question from Jane, which may trouble you slightly. Bit of a curveball. So she's envisaging, so she wondered if you were advising a 19-year-old, so you mentioned 19 as your magic number, if you were advising a 19-year-old British young person who decided they want to live in Africa, which country would you suggest they make their future and why?
Oh, that's very hard. Well, you could go anywhere and have fun, I think. If I were going to say, I would say, this is pretty random, but I would say Zimbabwe. The reason I would say Zimbabwe is because Zimbabwe is a total disaster at the moment. But it is a country with huge potential. If you go to South Africa, there are 3 million, at least, Zimbabweans, and they're kind of running the show. It's a very, very well-educated population. One of the few things that Mugabe did that was right was continued the kind of British education and expanded the British education system. And you have a very well-educated Zimbabwean population, even now. You have infrastructure that sort of vaguely is still intact. You have the remnants of a manufacturing industry that was there and has now been kind of run into the ground. All you would need in Zimbabwe is a decent government. Of course, it's the one thing that they haven't had. But I think you had a conversation recently on tipping points. Things happen slowly and then they happen all at once. If you got a decent government in Zimbabwe, and it kind of almost could have happened 3 or 4 years ago when Mugabe was kicked out. It didn't, but it could have done. If you had a decent government in Zimbabwe, that country can begin to rocket. So you could go, it'd be fine now, and if things turned out well, you'd find yourself in a country that was really motoring.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've got to stop because of the clock. Lots of questions were not put, and my apologies for that. But I'm sure you'll agree with me. We've had an incredibly engrossing evening, and I think David has really successfully taken on that challenge I thought was impossible, which was to give us this overview of this vast continent with so many countries, with great expertise in his talk, and I think you found his answers during the Q&A. Extremely fascinating. David, I hope you'll come back and update us sometime in the future. It's been great to have you here tonight. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks very much.